Welcome to the Coaches Table Podcast, where coaches come to grow personally and professionally through real-world application and online education. What is going on, everybody? Man. Week's flying by. It's a great week. It's the time's moving. If you are a coach in this time of the year, you feel like you're busier than ever. There's always loose ends to tie up. There's always things going on. There's always things happening, and you feel like your days just move so much faster than what they do at some other times in the year. But hey, guys, look, I'm super excited for this conversation. The gentleman that we have on today is very intelligent. He has developed his thought process on return to play, return to sport, all these other processes, which is really unique and interesting. If you follow him online, you will see that. And if you don't, you're making a mistake yourself. But before I introduce him and bring him on, guys, here's the deal. Look, we're growing on Spotify. We're growing on YouTube. And the only way that we do that is by you sharing the show. So do us a huge favor, share the show. We are continuing to get more listeners each week, each episode. And that's a thank you to y'all. If we do a good job, let somebody know. If we don't, let them know that as well. It's peer value exchange. If you get entertained, educated, or you think, man, that's a good idea, I'm going to implement that, let somebody else know because that's the only way the show grows. So if you guys would do that, I'd be very appreciative of that. And give us a like, follow, share, the whole nine on the social media standpoint. So, but Mr. Connor Sheopp, what's going on, man?
What's up, man? Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. I'm excited to have you on. I'm excited to kind of have this conversation as we're talking beforehand and stuff. So for those that don't know you, man, you kind of shared a little bit before, but this is what you shared is the reality of coaching, right? You moved several times in, a very short period of time. And you said, well, I felt like I kind of had to. And honestly, there's so many coaches that feel that same way, right? They are in a job that, the professional component is there. We're all training athletes, regardless of the logo that we have on our chest or the Nike or the Under Armour, whatever, right? This episode is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is the #1 performance platform for strength coaches around the world. Their software provides coaches with an elevated experience when it comes to program development, data tracking, and staying connected with athletes and clients. Coaches also have access to consultations with TeamBuildr's in-house sports scientists to help manage and analyze data. Head to teambuildr.com and sign up with promo code TABLE to start your free 30-day trial. That is TeamBuildr, TeamBuildr.com, and sign up with promo code TABLE to start your free 30-day trial. Coaches, this podcast is sponsored by Samsung Equipment. They have been providing elite strength training equipment and professional weight room solutions since 1976. If you value product quality, great customer service, and a company with integrity, make Samsung Equipment your go-to. Visit them at samsungequipment.com and let them know the Coaches Table Podcast gave you a seat at their table. That is Samsung Equipment, SAMSON Equipment.com, and let them know the Coaches Table Podcast gave you a seat at their table. But it's also like, what about the pay? What about the personal life? What about all the other roles and responsibilities? Do you have 27 teams and just you? Or is it like 1 or 2 teams and you can focus? And it's so interesting because everybody's always kind of looking, right? Because it's like, how do I get to a spot that's a little bit better for me? How was that kind of process for you throughout that time, man?
Yeah, it was tough, man, because like when I got in, I played, like we were talking about before, I played, low-level college football, and that was like all I knew. And I think like most people in that kind of position, like my idea of success was like, all right, I'm going to be SEC strength conditioning coach, right? Like,
yeah,
ball, most money, like that's it for me. And then like, I bounced around. I interned at Colorado State, Wake Forest, Miami, Mississippi State, and then I finally got my first position at Pitt. Had some movement there, ended up going back to Mississippi State, and I was only like 25 at the time, and I was like, oh wow, like this is it. This is like everything I ever wanted.
Yeah.
And then you live in it for a little bit, man, and you realize pretty quick that like it's maybe not all it's cracked up to be. And then you also kind of realize like, okay, like what actually brings me joy and like what actually gives me fulfillment. And, man, like it was cool. Like, I'm really thankful for the opportunities, but like playing in front of these like huge crowds, you get to work with these like freak athletes, like, there's some like prominence to getting to work at a really high level, but like at the end of the day, like that's not what's really getting me up in the morning.
Mm.
And so after that kind of like fell apart, had some other opportunities, bounced around a little bit, some part-time spots, seasonal position with the Cardinals.
Yeah.
Was out of work for a little bit, man, and then just ended up at Liberty University just kind of out of nowhere, man. I was trying to get back in the field, and to be honest, it was like the first place that was hiring after COVID. And
Yeah.
yeah, just took a chance, man. And it honestly, man, turned into being like the best decision I ever made just because, it brought me to a place where like, one, I was challenged with a new role of directing, a sports science department and really starting it from like ground zero.
Yeah.
And then, working with a sport in men's soccer that I really hadn't worked with a whole lot before that. And man, just getting to like go head first into like something that I really had no idea about and get to like, experience like what that's like with really as much autonomy as I could handle and with
Yeah.
as much of like a personal life balance you can probably ask for in this field. Um, Man, I've just been like so fortunate to be in the position that I am, and started to like kind of realize like, what actually matters and like what I actually need to focus on to kind of make this career like last and not just burn out after a couple years.
Um, I think that's a huge part, man. Everything you just said there is so true, because I too had similar thoughts. Like I played college ball, and at first I was like, yeah, I want to go be a big D1 director, football strength coach, right? and and then you kind of get into it, and you're like, oh, this is how that goes, right? And no shade on any football strength coaches, but you're just like, man, like, really? Like, we want to do it like this? Like, isn't there a smarter way to do this? Isn't there a better way to do this? And then, you might work with some other sports and you realize, hey, like this work life balance is way better, or the pay is actually pretty similar elsewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're just kind of like, okay, like yeah, you get to work with freak athletes, and I love that just as much as the next person does. Don't get me wrong, right? But at what cost, right? Like that's a question I think everybody has to ask, and at what cost? I'm going to do all this, comma, at what cost, right? And if you're willing to pay that price or not, and for how long too, right? That's always the biggest question mark too. I think what you said too at the back end of that, man, like having that personal life and the autonomy is something that I think everybody longs for and wants, but may not take the step to get there. And maybe that's swallowing their own pride, swallowing their own ego. How did you kind of, because going from football to Olympic, everybody thinks like, oh, I was in football, so I'm the best S&C coach ever, right? Blah, 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 whatever. How did you kind of be like, hey, look, like I'm here to do the job and do the job well, regardless of sport that's being trained? Because for a lot of people, they struggle with that component of it. They look at the sport to give them value, right? Rather than the quality of training per se.
Yeah, man. So I think it was like football is tough, and like again, like there's a lot of great football strength conditioning coaches that are doing a lot of awesome things. Like
Yep.
I think those guys can get a little bit of a bad rap at times just because like
Yeah.
they can be a little bit easy to pick on. But like a lot of great people out there doing great stuff. But in a lot of cases, man, if you're an assistant strength conditioning coach in football, you're kind of just running someone else's program. And then your duties on top of that, if you're not working for, a good boss, man, like you're just kind of, doing a lot of administrative stuff. You're making sure guys weigh in and out. You're making sure they show up to meetings on time. Like you're doing
Yep.
all these things, man. And I was really fortunate. Like I've got to work for great bosses, Corey Boucher, Dave Andrews, Buddy Morris, like unbelievable people that like gave me autonomy,
Yeah.
letting me work with like developmental guys and return to play in the sports science aspect. So that was great. But like I knew for me, man, that I wanted to be in a position, and I think the next step for me in my career was to be in a spot where I could kind of call the shots and maybe
Yeah.
do things, the way that I wanted them done, and take all these experiences that I learned and actually apply them. Because I think like you can learn a lot by working with great people, obviously, and I think I did for sure, and I'm so thankful for those opportunities. But like until you can kind of make the mistakes for yourself and put yourself in a
Mm,
position to actually see like, okay, like I have this framework of all this knowledge that I've collected. Okay, but
yeah,
like if I don't know how to filter that to athletes in the sport that I'm working with, nothing else really matters.
yeah. That's so true. It's like it's so funny. Like if you look at the role of S&C, you go intern, graduate assistant. So if you're a GA, you're probably calling your own shots for the teams that you have with the guidance or the oversight of a full-time staff, right? Awesome, great, cool. And then if you go the football route, like you said, you're maybe a fifth assistant somewhere or a fourth or whatever, and then you got to work your way up. Well, you're still essentially running somebody else's program unless you're the number two guy or the first assistant or whatever, right? And that doesn't mean you don't have influence, and it doesn't mean you don't have the ability to program and do things of your nature. But like you're saying, like you are running somebody else's program. And then I look at it almost, and my thought is like a lot of times when somebody becomes a new head guy, it's not only their first time doing that, but it's also their first time probably articulating their thought process, their vision to a staff. And so you get a little bit of a mix of running your own program, one, right? And then the leadership component of it, two. And so some people can handle that extremely well. And there's outstanding football S&C coaches. So for those listening, don't take it that we're hating on football S&C. It's just the reality of it. There are some really, really outstanding ones. And just like everything, there's some ones that suck, just no different than the Olympic side. There's really outstanding Olympic coaches, and there's ones that just flat out suck. But there's a mixture of both things that new person, that new head guy is attempting to learn, right? Leadership role and the articulation of their vision of the program, etc. So let me ask this question then. When you were doing your own thing with the autonomy and you're doing the sports science stuff and you're doing the RTP stuff, when you were still on the football side, is that kind of where your love or your desire to learn more about that started? Or where did your kind of desire to learn about sports science, RTP kind of start?
Yeah, so like kind of like with like starting out on like the football side, man, like especially even as an intern, like you have your head guy and then you have maybe your head assistant who
Yep.
does like a little bit more like the administrative stuff or maybe he's helping with programming. And then from there, like you're generally like delineating responsibilities out. Like one guy's going to be return to play, one guy's
Yep.
going to be sports science, one guy's going to be maybe nutrition or like class scheduling or stuff like that, right? And for whatever reason, man, I just had always kind of gravitated towards the sports science aspect and the
Yeah.
return to play more than anything. And just is probably just because like it was the advice I got early on is like, you know, you need to be able to find a way to kind of set yourself apart from other people. And like, I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of really good coaches out there, man. But like, if all you can do is like read off a sheet and yell cues in a room, man, like you're not bringing that much value, right? Like I kind
Yeah.
of get upset, man. Like obviously, I think as a field we're like grossly underpaid and undervalued. Like that goes without saying. But like
Yep.
if that's all you can do, man, like I can't be upset for you. Like when you're only making 40K a year, man. So like my idea was, man, like if I'm gonna make it in this field, like I need to develop hard skills that I can actually like take to a place and be like, hey, man, like this is something that I can do and something that I'm good at. That's going to help me bring value to your team and try to like at least make me a little bit more hireable.
That is absolutely spot on. If you guys are listening to this and you're like kind of stuck and you're like, how can I separate myself? How can I showcase legitimate skills, right? That you can show that nobody else can do. Go back and listen to what Connor just said, because that is a huge difference. And what he's saying is that differentiator is what allowed him to continue to excel, continue to develop these skill sets to where now he's started sports science departments. He's doing it himself. He can get in depth with that. And that becomes invaluable because now you've made yourself extremely valuable to a company, whether it's in the sports performance world or elsewhere, that you can have these legitimate skill sets. It's one of the things that like skills get paid, right? Like And so if all, like you said, if all you can do is read off a sheet, like cool, but that's a low level skill, right? Like that's a very low level skill. But if you can do advanced data analysis and data analytics, and then articulate that to a staff on how it could potentially impact performance, that's a much higher level skill that deserves a much higher dollar amount to it, and not many people can do that. So with the with your sports science stuff, kind of walk me through your process, if you will. How did you get it started at Liberty? And then what were your trials there, and where are you guys at now that you're like, oh man, like what is square one look like of starting a sports science department?
Yeah, so we kind of had some highs and lows, especially on the front end of this thing, man. Like when I got here, they had a GA running it, and he did a great job, but like really hadn't experienced a whole lot of things outside of just here at Liberty. And to be honest, he had like a bunch of other responsibilities that were pulling him in different directions. So like it was kind of this ground zero, like, hey, like, we have some tech, we've done some things in the past, but like we haven't really made any like actionable decisions off of it. So I think coming in, man, like one, it was like obviously relationships, trying to like get people to buy in, not just in, the sports science department, but like on the performance staff, athletic training, administration, so we can, hopefully get more funding and more people to help with it. And then probably more importantly than anything, the coaches and the athletes that we actually work with, and explain to them like why we do what we do and what it is that we actually do. I think sports science is this like kind of like catch 22 term of like everybody's like heard of it, but they don't like
Yeah.
actually really know what it is. Like I think they think I sit in like a lab coat and like spend my whole day like coding on a computer, when that's like 5% of my job is actual like data implementation and analytics. But like for me, man, it was like starting relationships, and then from there, like what are the low hanging fruit of like, okay, these are things that we can collect and make actionable decisions on. And like I think everybody's been in this place, man. Like whether you're a
Yep.
sports scientist or a strength conditioning coach or whatever it is, like whatever field you work in performance, like
Yeah.
collecting data, and it just ends up sitting in an Excel sheet and nothing really happens with it.
Yeah.
So like, and I've been to a lot of places, man, where that's the reality, and no fault of anyone. It's just kind of the way things kind of shake out sometimes. So like, my biggest thing was like, all right, once we develop these relationships, we give people an understanding of what it is we're trying to do and what we're capable of doing, and then how can we take this data and make just actionable decisions. And for me, man, it was
Mm.
just like, we're going to have a baseline assessment, and we're going to be able to visualize this data for coaches, for athletes, and we're going to have
Sure.
like these decision trees about how we're
Yes.
actually going to use this information, whether that's GPS, force plates, movement screens, or whatever.
Yeah. So what does that look like? Let's dive deeper then. So when we're talking actionable decisions and then decision trees, can you give us a couple examples of what you have? Because I understand what you're saying, right? But for those that are listening, what does that look like? Is it, hey, we're collecting RPE and session duration to get a trip score to then potentially show, are we having too many high days, or, what does that look like? Or is it, hey, we're integrating obviously like force stacks, and we're integrating health and wellness questionnaires, which is kind of basic, but what does that actionable data look like, and what do the decision trees look like for you? Whether it's both general in regards of a sports science or in conjunction with your RTP stuff.
Yeah. So I'll start out with just like our baseline assessment, right? Because that's probably
Yep.
like the thing where I've felt I've had the most success with, of just like getting them on the force plate, right? So we use Hawking
Right.
Dynamics.
Sure.
Every athlete will go through a battery of tests on the force plates twice a year.
Yep.
And based off of that information, they will, if somebody pops in red, they will go into a specific, you know, flow chart of like what needs to be done. So like an easy example is like a single leg counter movement jump, right?
Yep.
So we'll take all of our high risk athletes of, through a single leg counter movement jump, 3 to 4 reps each side, and we'll just start to look at those asymmetries between left and right leg, right? And a lot of this stuff is influenced by Chris Bishop, awesome researcher that's just looking
Yep.
at a lot of asymmetry stuff on the force plates. and just kind of bringing it down from like, okay, 0 to 10%, that's good. All right, we're good with that. That's green light. We're good to go. 10 to 15%, okay, that's yellow. That means that we need to have a conversation between AT, sports performance, myself, and the athlete. All right, we need to understand like, okay, was it, is it previous injury history? Is there something going on right now that we're not aware of? Um, is it just like a motor control issue of like, so this
Mhm.
athlete is not really that competent on that leg, right? And then let's say if it's greater than that 15% mark, then we need to know like, okay, we actually need to have an intervention here, right?
Yeah,
We need to get them on some more unilateral loading. We need to
sure.
take them through another movement screen of like, working all the way from the feet all the way up to the head, testing, passive and active ranges of motion, internal, external rotation, hip flexion, whatever it is,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
probably revisit some ground zero programming, just like kind of reprogram, some of those basic movement patterns, as
Yep.
well as kind of catch that asymmetry up a little bit to what we deem an appropriate level, right? So that's just like a basic example of like, hey, get 3 or 4 jumps on each plate, and then we can immediately say, hey, looking at this information, this is what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like that, it is fantastic, and that's an example, right? For those that are
Yeah.
listening, like if you're not doing that, I think a lot of people have force decks, but I think a lot of people just do a counter movement jump. You know what I'm saying? Which is
Mm-hmm.
great, which is great. Don't get me wrong, and it's fantastic, and we all do it, but it's not the only thing you can do, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people need to also kind of take into consideration. Like, there's other things you can do with those force decks, whether it's reactive jumps, ISOs, obviously single leg component, obviously, bilateral, and you can start to what I like to call group categorize and then standardize, right? Um, your athletes, your teams, your positions, and now if I take this one step further and I'm looking, 2, 3 years down the road, you can start to bring up, your freshmen in and say, okay, hey, look, here's where you're at. Or I've talked to people and they have their recruits do it, right? And then they look at it from a recruiting standpoint. Does this individual have the necessary minimum requirements, or is he so far off that, maybe we don't even want to start looking at him anymore, right? Like, or hey, do we think we can work with this? All of that kind of starts to play a role in it, and you can really take it to the next level, if you will, with previous injury history and all that other stuff. But it's like now you can start to essentially use it as a recruiting standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, no, I think there's so much value in like being able to create like just normative data within your teams. I think like in performance in general and like across the
yeah,
field, man, I think like we get a little too concerned with about like what other places are doing, what other athletes are capable of. Like I think, man, we need to spend a little bit more time just as like a field in general of like identifying like where our athletes are at and then how do
yeah,
they rank amongst their peers, their position group, their age, and kind of track that trend longitudinally over that 4 to 5 year career. Because to
yeah,
me, like that's really where we start to like see changes and trends that we can like start to identify of like, okay, like now we have this like basically 4 year case study on this athlete, and we
yep,
can really like peel back the layers of like, okay, why is this happening or why isn't this happening?
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely right. And then, with that, you can do so much with that. And now, if you're talking about influencing and impacting performance, you can really see that, right? Um, so, how do you then tie in your sports science with your RTP? And what does that kind of look like for your athletes currently? And we'll start there because I have more questions, obviously, for you. But we'll start there. How do you kind of tie in your sports science with your RTP?
Yeah, man. So like it goes back, like the most important thing that we like as soon as we get an athlete on campus, we want to get a baseline assessment on them, right? So we have some historical data that, God forbid, injury happens early in camp and we have nothing to work back on. So like
Right.
having that like historical data to me is like the most important part. And
Yeah.
then from there, it's been a bit of a process, and we're working on it right now, just in terms of like creating all these return to play standards and expectations for what it should look like, whether that's you know ACL tears, hamstring tears, groin. We're building out shoulder right now. Eventually, going to get to the ankle, and how we can
Sure.
implement the sports science aspect into that. For me, what it is, man, is like once we get a greater understanding of these injuries specifically, we can start to create objectives and methods that we want to utilize and progressions within each phase. And then from there, using the sports science aspect as exit criteria to move on to the next
Mhm.
phase. So we don't focus on timelines necessarily, even though, like, yes, there is some value in understanding like general timelines and tissue healing and things like that. But we're more so like focused on, okay, when can we progress the athlete based on when they are ready, and using this normative data, man, has been such a blessing for us, and probably the thing that we've had the most luck with in terms of like effectively progressing athletes, right? Because like how it is, man. Like you'll get some injured athletes that just like they kind of get lost in the shuffle, man, and like they get stuck in these like kind of cookie cutter rehab programs where you know, it takes them, 8 to 12 weeks. When in reality, man, like if you were to progress them by the time they were ready and by the time they showed they're ready through objective data, man, they could have maybe cut that time in half. And right.
Yeah,
And like, ultimately, like my goal with all this stuff is like athlete health and performance. Like
sure.
that's what I worry about more than anything. But like, we also want to win at the same time. And if I can get an athlete back sooner and healthier, man, like I think that is probably, if not more valuable, but just as valuable as anything else I can offer an athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is winning then in itself, right? I mean, a form of it, right? Because obviously there's a difference between winning ball games, but if we know that availability is one of the best abilities, if not the best ability for the athletes that are there for us. And so cutting that time down from let's say 10 weeks to 6, well that's a big win, right? Like that's huge. How many competitions could occur in that 4 week window that they are now a part of, right? So when you talk about progressing or regressing from, let's say, an athlete unfortunately gets injured, that's the reality of it. But when you talk about progressing and regressing, how do you kind of look at that? We can use whatever injury you would like to kind of elicit an example, but what does that kind of look like? Is it that you're looking at range of motion, magnitude of force, angle of force? Is it just total, getting range of motion back? Is it, and I know some of them are very specific because each case is different, but what's your kind of general guideline from that standpoint?
Yeah, so they're all going to follow like a similar kind of setup, like I already kind of talked about. Like we're going to have already pre-planned phases, and each of
Mm-hmm.
those phases are going to have objectives and methods and progressions that we want to focus on, and then exit criteria for each one of those phases, right? And that's where like you have to have like a greater understanding of like anatomy and the actual injury that's occurring and like what the diagnosis is, so
Yeah.
we can actually set them up like based on a little bit of historical data for like an effective return, right? So like I'll give you an example of like an ACL tear.
Sure.
So right now, let's say soccer player tears their ACL. Okay, they immediately start phase zero, right? So for me, that's pre-op. That's as soon as the injury occurs. We're talking about focusing on nutrition. Um, can we start to supplement protein? Can we start to supplement some things that are going to maybe help get the inflammation down? Can we start to reacclimate them to, a normal of a training environment as we can, man? So, if, like my role, man, like if you get hurt, you get 72 hours to cry, and then we're back to training, right? Like
Yeah.
you need to get in this mindset of like, hey, like it's a traumatic event, especially in that specific scenario, but like that doesn't make you special. That doesn't make you a victim, man. Like we got to get back into the weight room and we got to get working, right? Um, you know, and most importantly, man, like a time for like communication, a time for getting all necessary parties involved. Like we're fortunate to be at a place where like we have a sports psychologist, we have a full time nutritionist, we have an unbelievable athletic training staff, performance coaches. myself and
Yeah.
sports scientists that can like work together and like start to like create some of these plans to make sure they're in a good position, right? So once we get done with phase zero, we've prepped for surgery. We've laid out our plan for the next, 5 to 6, 7 months, whatever it's going to be. They go into the
Hmm.
night, they come back out. Okay, now we're back at phase one, right? We're probably looking at like 4 to 6 weeks. If there's meniscus damage, probably can, or if there is meniscus damage, probably going to take a little bit longer, but we're just attacking full range of motion. We're attacking general strength. We're trying to re educate them on their gait.
Yeah.
And we're just again going through these like basic like check marks of like, okay, what are our objectives during each phase, and then what are our exit benchmarks, right? And so for like that scenario would be like, is your gait back? Is your swelling down? Has the scar healed? Things like that, right? Then let's say we move on to phase two, we can start to implement like, okay, now we're back into more of a traditional training sense. Like we're really starting to target that leg. We're really
Yeah.
starting to, address some of these imbalances, and we're already starting our return to running progression, right? We're starting it from the jump, and it may just start out, man, like, you know, whether it's plyos, whether it's sprinting, whether it's change of direction, man. Like that's one thing I see a lot of people make mistakes on is waiting way too long to start to get back some of these things. And that doesn't mean, we get them out on the floor and we sprint them from day one, man. But like something as simple, man, as like an oscillatory, like pogo where my feet don't leave the ground, where we can get their quads activated and we can start to address some of those neural inhibitions that came from that injury, man. And
Yeah.
there's just so much value from that. And like incrementally progressing them throughout the rest of those phases, man, I think people would be amazed how much more improvement and how much more aggressive we can be with the rehab process, right? So like for me, man, like I'm pretty much, the common like trends that you'll see in like an ACL rehab process is like anywhere from like 6 to 9 months now. Um,
Yeah.
Man, we can get people back. Like I think if it's done correctly in 5, 5.5, 6 months at max, by just
Um,
taking like super linear progressions, man. And it's like it's not necessarily that we're doing anything crazy, man. Like I think people think it's got to be this like super complex thing, man. But we're just taking like basic
yeah.
training principles and applying it to this rehab process, right? So like, you know, we're making sure that we have a high and a low day. We make sure that like we're like in the training room as well as in the weight room, we're complementing each other, right? We want our hard days in here to be our hard days in there, our low days in there to be our low days in here. We want to
Yep.
make sure that, like, you know, we're taking a holistic approach to these things. And the cool thing about like these long term rehab cases
Yeah.
is really, man, we can just take like basic linear periodization and just move along. Because that's the cool thing about it, man, is like it's kind of like creative for it because like linear periodization, in my opinion, it doesn't really work in like the chaotic sporting environment, right? Like you look
Good.
at like basketball, for example, man, like you're playing a game on a Wednesday, then you're going to play a game on Friday, then you got a week off, then you're going to play Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Like it's too chaotic, man. But like once you get these athletes in a one-on-one scenario where
Yeah.
you have this extended time period, man, and like that's something, man, I think a lot of people take for granted. Of like name another time in an athlete's career, even life, where you're going to get them one-on-one. You're not going to have to worry about sporting volume, and we can just train, man, and we can
Yeah.
get after it, and just like as long as you understand like solid progressions, because like the
Mhm.
base is lower and the price of error is higher, especially early on in the process. But man, if you can just progress athletes based upon when they're ready and you challenge them effectively and appropriately, I think you'd be amazed about like how much a better job we could do in this return to play game.
That's freaking huge. Um, that's
Sorry, I went on a little
absolutely
bit of a
huge.
rant there.
No, you're good, man. I love it. I love it because I think more people need to be thinking down that thought process. I think what you said is extremely valuable. Because you're right, man. How often do you get to train an athlete one on one and you don't have to worry about the chaos of sport or the chaos of travel schedule or the chaos of stress with practice, with performance, with all that other stuff, right? Like we, everybody kind of talks about us being like stress managers per se, right? Um, both practice and then obviously like training with us. And it's just like, well, one of the major stressors, unfortunately, when an athlete gets injured is the removal of practice. However, there is still stress from a cognitive load, from a confidence load, from a obviously the body's trying to repair itself and everything, and that is still stress there. But I feel like what you're saying too is you get to really develop that relationship with them and just train and watch the progress kind of happen right in front of you to then say, we've now helped you prepared for the demands of practice, your gait, of the sport itself, because we got to essentially hyper focus on this one component, which should and hopefully prepare you for what you're here for.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's crazy from that standpoint, right? Like, um, so okay. One other thing that I think is really important, especially like with an injury and an RTP, how do you address the mental side, or how does your team psychologist kind of address that? Because we know an injury occurs, a lot of athletes want to get back, but one of the things that struggles, and I think maybe yourself, but myself, when I got injured too, is like you don't trust yourself per se, at times, right? You also are like, can my body do this? You have that hesitation in the back of your head for that split second, or whatever the case may be. How do you guys kind of work through that with the athlete? And how do you kind of see that in your training as well?
Yeah, so I think that's probably honestly like the most important aspect of like the whole return to play process. Like, you know, I don't mean to like typecast anybody, but like an athlete has a catastrophic injury, I'm gonna have a pretty good idea of how they're gonna handle it just based on their personality and like
Right.
being around them. Like, and that's the challenge in and of itself, man. But like for me, man, where I think a lot of people make mistakes, it's just like they baby it and they treat this like they're this like they're victims, and
Yeah.
it's it does, but like you're not special, right? Like,
Mhm.
thousands of people tear their ACLs every day. Like it's not that big a deal. Like, yeah, it's gonna suck for the next 6 to 8 months, but like getting them back into the training environment, educating them on why it's important, and I think just talking them through it, man, and like getting them back in a routine, getting them back around their teammates, getting them back around and evolve their like around their sport. Man, I just think there's so much value in that. It's like
Yeah.
that's the biggest thing, right? Because like especially in like college athletics, man,
Yeah.
and I know I was this way too, man. Like your identity lies within your sport and your ability to play your sport. And when you take that away from them, man, I think they feel like they lose such a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
But that's why we can't allow them to get away from that. We need to make sure that they understand, like, no, you still are an athlete. No, we still need to train. No, you still need to be around your teammates. You need
Yep.
to do those little things still, right? And it's not
Yep.
going to be comfortable. And you're still going to have bad days, man. But like,
Yeah.
man, I just think there's so much value in like getting the athletes in training, and I think from like the mental standpoint, man, of just like challenging them. Like,
Yeah.
it's tough in and of itself. And I'm not saying like you need to bring them in and absolutely wipe the floor with them. And I made that mistake
Yeah.
early on in my career, just because of like
Yeah.
like somebody would get hurt, and I'm like, all right, man, we're gonna hit single leg presses for 2 months, and I'm just gonna hammer that thing, and like we're gonna do battle ropes, and we're gonna do this every day. Like that probably hurts them more than it helps them, just because I think you're robbing like energy resources that could be allocated towards recovering. But I do think there is a time and a place, man, during that process. Like you have to challenge them, and you have to set them up for success in those challenges, right? Like you have to put them in a position to like, okay, this is gonna suck, but I'm gonna put you in a spot to where you're gonna be successful, and you're gonna
Yeah.
build your confidence back through that process.
Yeah. I think that's utterly important because what we all see, and if you've trained any athletes to any extent, you'll know that this is true. Let's say an athlete injures their ankle, right? And very low level injury, maybe they're in a boot or say, but they come in, they go, I can't train anything else. And you're like, what? Right? Or like maybe their knees bothering them and they're just like, I can't train at all. And it's like, we have 3/4 of your body we can still train. Like, what are you talking about? But you see them
Mhm.
and they will fight you on it, right? Like they will adamantly fight you on it and be like, I can't train at all. And they just like have a pity party for themselves. And then it's 3 weeks go by and they haven't done anything because, like you said, they get lost in the shuffle or they don't think it's important. They fade away from the team. Everybody, relationships happen without them. The game's still going on, right? Like,
Mm.
but a lot of them will fight you on, I can't do this, I can't do that, blah blah blah. And you're saying the exact opposite, and I agree with you. You're like, no, look, this is exactly why you need to be in here training. We can work that uninjured leg, like all this other stuff. But it's very interesting to see how often they'll come in and they're just like, I can't do anything. It's like, oh, so you just want to take however long off now? Is that what it is? Like, it's so interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, no, that's a battle, and I think everyone faces it. Like I said, I'm extremely fortunate to where I really have one team, and then I do some individual return to play cases, and I
Yeah.
have just as much support as I need, man. But especially when you talk about some of those places, man, where you got 3 or 4 teams and
Yeah.
100 athletes, man. I get it. It is tough. And at the end of the day, man, you can only do so much for them. And something I even struggle with, man, is maybe I'm doing too much with them. Maybe I'm holding their
Mhm.
hand too much. Maybe I'm robbing them the opportunity of them holding themselves accountable or learning the lesson that hey, oh, maybe I did screw myself by not showing up or not putting in the effort that I knew I should have been doing. Right. So I think it's a balance, man, of logistically what can you handle, and
Yeah.
then kind of where do you draw that line of all right, man, I'm going to bring my 50% to the table. You at least got to meet me halfway, and if not, man,
Yes.
I'm cool. I'm cool giving my energy to the people that want it. Because at the end of the day, man,
Yeah.
we all work way too hard and way too long for probably not enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I think you got to do that to save yourself a little bit of times too, because you know how it is, man. Everything sounds like a great idea till you're spending 14 hours a day at the office and sleeping 6 hours and drinking 3 Red Bulls a day, and it just
Yeah.
ain't worth it.
No, dude, it's so true though, and it's so funny, and like this may hit strong with some people too, but it's like you literally read my mind. Like, you got to meet me halfway. Like, you literally read my mind because I was about to say that, but it's like because I mean, this is gonna cause stir, but I don't really care. But what occurs is, okay, athlete gets injured, okay, and what you do and what I do and what I believe probably what a lot of strength coaches do and ATs is like, we're going to put together this elaborate plan that we've actually spent time thinking about, planning about, or we have our process in place. And then we're going to get the athlete right. We're going to plan. It sounds good. And then the athlete never shows up, right? Or shows up sporadically. And then a coach or somebody's like, well, why aren't they getting better? And you're like, well, they didn't freaking show up. But then they'll look at you and be like, well, you didn't do your job. And you're like, are you kidding me? Right? Or the athletes will be like, you weren't there for me. It's like, you never showed up, bro.
Yeah.
Like the work was here. You just didn't come get it. And it's funny how they'll try and pin the tail on the donkey on us per se. And it's just like, no, 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 no. And you're just like, well, how much am I going to do for you when you're doing none for me? Right? Like, you gotta come meet me, and you gotta come with a good attitude. You gotta put some effort in, right? You can't just come and mope around. Meh, meh, meh. No, that's garbage. Like, because if you're gonna waste my time, like, that's not happening.
Mhm.
But that's a very real and true reality for a lot of people in that position.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad. But kind of, where can people find you online if they want to have more conversation with you in regards of RTP sports science, in regards of they're trying to figure out themselves, like what are some exit criterias they're trying to figure out. They have more questions. Where can people find you online, man?
Yeah, Twitter at Connor.Shepp, or actually just Connor Shepp, ConnorSchepp, and then same thing on Instagram. Liberty emails online. Feel free to shoot me an email. Probably honestly get back to you the quickest through Instagram, but yeah,
Yeah.
anybody want to reach out, talk shop, always happy to share anything that I'm doing or anything that we got going on here at Liberty.
Yeah, man, I think it's what they got was a great insight on what a high performance strategic planning, thought process, and execution looks like, in regards of some ideas for them to chew on, some ideas for them to execute on, and how can they make their program better from an RTP standpoint, from a sports science standpoint, and actually putting numbers down to say, positionally speaking, sports speaking, RTP speaking, exit speaking. I think when we put that data, the normative data, or those standards there, we now have something to say, this is where we need to get you to, right? And I think that's really important, because a lot of times we just talk about it. We don't actually like put pen to paper, right? Or print it out and say, this is where we need you to be. I think that's really important for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. No doubt.
So, man, I want to appreciate you for coming on, though. I appreciate you, what you're doing. I love what you put out. Keep doing that, please, because I think it's helping so many people, and I think this will also help a lot of people as well. So I just want to say thank you for you, who you are, what you've done, what you are currently doing, and what you're going to continue to do. And I look forward to more conversations, because I think there's a lot more there. But, man, I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you and your time, man.
No doubt, man. Appreciate you having me on. Had a blast.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Guys, if you're listening to this, if you got something from this, do us a huge favor, share the show, okay? That's the only way the show grows. It's the only way that we can continue to reach more coaches, not only strength coaches, not only ATs, dietitians, not only sport coaches, but everybody that's involved in the process. Do us a huge favor, share the show. If you got entertained, educated, you felt like you resonated with something here, share the show. Let somebody know, hey, like, you really need to listen to this, because it's going to help you. It's going to benefit you in your situation, because a lot of what we talked about is the reality. Because we're both in the trenches doing it every day. So we would appreciate that, and we'll catch y'all on the next.